Okay, so if you remember from the last video, England, we have the French and Indian War, which is a smaller part of the Seven Years' War, right? And England is now faced with horrible debt. They have this new responsibility of not only policing um, the western part of the eastern half of the United States, but they also have to deal with ways to pay off this debt. And so they start to pass a number of laws to tax the colonists in America, which had not paid taxes before this. And so it's going to create this disunity between the British colonists that are in the American colonies and England, right? And so we have guys like up here, we have James Otis and Patrick Henry that make huge speeches to their assemblies. Otis says that taxation without representation is tyranny, right? And so England doesn't have a right to do this, tax the American colonists, and Patrick Henry calls for no taxation without representation. The dirty little secret of this is that once we actually get into negotiations with the British, the American colonists really don't want representation, because if they did have representation in the British Parliament, they would just be outvoted. Really, what they want to do is they want to have a bone to pick with England. They want to not be taxed, so they want no taxation, and ultimately they want no representation. So it ought to be like, no taxation, no representation would be a more apt calling for what they're looking for. So we're getting people together. We decide we're going to discuss the Stamp Act. In 1765, Massachusetts invites the other colonies to meet up in New York and discuss how we're going to respond to the Stamp Act. Right? Nine of the colonies show up, and they decide they're going to issue something called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And basically, they just outline the ideas of the fact that the Stamp Act is a direct tax, and the colonists don't have representation. Um, the loss of trial by jury in the um, um, in the Sugar Act, those types of things. And so they start to just address their concerns with the king, and they put that together. And so that's the upper class. That's the upper crust. Those are the people that have lots of money. On the street, at the local level, you start to see, a populist uprising in support of change as well. And that's going to be seen mostly in this organization called the Sons of Liberty. It's begun in Boston. It's kind of led in some ways by Sam Adams, who's basically in cahoots with John Hancock. But anyways, these are artisans and shopkeepers and merchants. Just think of them as small businessmen, laborers, those types of people, and they're going to be the more violent side of this public opposition to the ideas of the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act and those types of things, right? They're going to burn an effigy, which is just a big like paper mache looking creature. They're going to burn it, make it look like Andrew Oliver, and they're going to behead it. They're going to throw stones at Andrew Oliver, who's the Stamp Act collector in Boston. They're going to break into his house and mess things up. And Oliver's like, well, forget this. This job isn't worth it. And he resigns. And so the Sons of Liberty are like, hey, this works. So let's move on to the bigger fish. And so then they go to the governor of Massachusetts, who is Thomas Hutchinson, who is, he's a British subject, and they demand that he renounce the Stamp Act. And when he doesn't, they loot his house and they burn his house. They light it on fire with Hutchinson inside. Right. And so, I mean, these are pretty drastic, violent, intimidating actions taken by these people. There's going to be a sister group called the Daughters of Liberty. And to be honest, they're the ones that actually get the work done. The Sons of Liberty are all flash, and the Daughters of Liberty, in lots of ways, are all cash, because they are going to band together and they are going to boycott British goods. They're going to start to make their own tea. really out of coffee ground. They're going to start to, this is where Americans are going to start to switch from tea to coffee. Excuse me. Some communities are even going to begin to spin their own yarn again, their own fabric to avoid buying British textiles. So think about this within that first 100 years, like when the colonists first come over, when England first starts actually setting up colonies, which roughly is about 1600, right? So within that first 150 years to 1750, the colonists no longer make their stuff. Like when they first got to America, they had to make everything. And then we start to see the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, in which England is transitioning away from homemade stuff, and they're starting to produce factory made goods and the ways of textile and whatnot. And so the Americans begin to just import that. And so by 1760s, when we start to see this uprising, most Americans were now buying the majority of their textiles or their fabric from England. Now all of a sudden, bam, America's going to stop doing that. We're going to revert back to our ways of making our own clothes, right? And this is going to be powerful because this boycott's going to be powerful because women were typically the main purchaser of goods. They're the buyer of goods for the household. And if women stop buying stuff, then England, the merchants in England that are relying on the colonists to buy things from them, begin to take note, and they begin to put pressure on the British government to ease up some of the economic restraints that are placed on their subjects. Right. This is really the first time that women have taken on a political role in the United States, or in what will become the United States and the American colonies, and they're wildly successful, right? They put enough pressure on the English merchants that the change ultimately comes about. The rich, powerful power brokers in America, the people that were at the Stamp Act Congress, whatever, they'll denounce the violence of the common people, like that will tar and feather people, like we have in this next slide, and the tar and feather people, or hang effigies from the Liberty Tree. But they support the idea, right? And so the rich aren't going to redirect, let's say, aren't going to redirect the anger of the poor. When the British merchants are upset enough, and enough money is lost through these economic boycotts that the women in America are putting out, um, the British government is going to face that pressure from their merchants in England, and they're going to repeal the Stamp Act. And so in March of 1767, the Stamp Act is repealed, and John Hancock, who's pictured here, buys everybody in Boston a drink. Because it allows Hancock to, kind of still smuggle goods in, I suppose, right? But shortly thereafter, Parliament passes something called the Declaratory Act that basically says, look, we got rid of the Stamp Act, which was a direct tax, but just remember that Parliament is the supreme law of the land, and if you guys pass any laws over there in your little colonies that go against what we're doing, then we'll consider them null and void. All right, so a little bit of time passes. Charles Townshend becomes advisor to the Prime Minister, William Pitt, and he's put in charge of the American colonies, right? And so he comes up with this idea that, well, he's put in charge of raising revenue from the colonies. And so he looks at some of the past problem, and he's like, oh, well, the problem must be, boom, that the colonists didn't like that direct tax. And so what we'll do is we'll place this Revenue Act in 1767 on them that places an indirect tax. It's almost like a tariff on imported goods that are imported into the American colonies. Excuse me. And so we have that. We also have the Restraining Act that breaks up the New York Assembly because until it pays for the quartering of the troops that were in New York, right? And so this Revenue Act doesn't really raise a whole lot of money, but what it does is it raises just enough money that we can pay the salaries of the royally appointed judges that oversee basically the smuggling courts from the Sugar Act, right? And so the Revenue Act gives these custom boards greater powers to fight smuggling, which is going to further infuriate really the people, the Port of Boston, because a lot of Bostonians are involved in some somewhat shady deals, right? And any major port city is there's going to be contraband coming in, Boston specifically, right? We have this idea of blanket search warrants. The English can just search any boat that's coming into a harbor, right? And so we have the Townsend Act. And so Samuel Adams responds to the Townsend Act by publishing something called the Massachusetts Circular, which argues that taxation without representation is unconstitutional, and it encourages other colonies to take up the fight against protesting British goods, not just Boston, not just Massachusetts. The argument is like, look, if England can do this to Massachusetts and Boston, then it can do it to Charleston, they can do it to Baltimore, can do it to any of the other areas. And so Sam Adams publishes this with the approval of the Massachusetts Assembly, and England is just furious, beside themselves. The British demand that Adams retract his words, and they dissolve the Massachusetts Assembly until Adams does, and Adams is like, I'm not going to do this. And other colonies start to see how England is treating Massachusetts and Boston, and they start to sympathize with their brothers. And so that disconnect that we talked about at the tail end of that last video, that disconnect between the different colonies, these 13 separate entities, all of a sudden they're like, well, yeah, we might be different, but we were starting to see things that are very similar. And so the Daughters of Liberty begin to form another boycott against some of these Townsend Acts. And in response to this, the British are going to send more troops over, and they put down, they station 4,000 troops in Boston, which doesn't sound like a lot, but like it's a fair amount in a city. And these troops, they work for a short period of time during the day, and then they have their nights off. And so they start to moonlight as dock workers in the nights, and they start to steal jobs from Bostonians. And then the people of Boston are forced to pay for the room and board, and it's going to infuriate the working class of Boston, right? That probably doesn't need a whole lot of encouragement to be kind of disagreeable to begin with. And so John Hancock is one of the wealthiest men in America. He's a smuggler, and one of his ships gets caught and boarded, and it gets seized into the customs courts, right? And Hancock basically orders the Sons of Liberty to attack the British troops at the custom house and free his ship, and it sails off. And so like Hancock isn't going to be charged with smuggling. And so more troops are called in to put down this riot, and there's this growing tension between the working class people of Boston and the Sons of Liberty and John Hancock and Sam Adams and the troops that are on the ground in Boston. And that tension is going to grow for about 2 years until March 5th of 1770. There's going to be a group of Bostonians that are probably drinking at a bar in March. They've been Boston during think about the weather in Massachusetts during this time frame. There's going to be lots of snow in the winter. It's going to shut down a lot of the things to do. And so, March, the thaw's starting to begin at least a little bit. And there's a group of Bostonians that are gathered outside of a customs house, probably after they've been having some drinks. And they begin to throw snowballs and rocks at the troops that are outside of the customs house. And they start to yell at them. They call them, redbacks or lobsterbacks, which doesn't sound like a horrible insult to us, but lobsters were seen as like bottom feeders. It's like calling somebody it would be like a catfish, but you wouldn't call somebody a catfish today. That's something you would do to somebody. But anyways, it's an insult. And so the soldiers ultimately what happens is they fire back into this crowd of people and they kill 5 people, right? And so the Sons of Liberty with Sam Adams, who was a silversmith, they create a silver pressing of the event, and they sell them as souvenirs to show the cruelty of Boston and to get the word out. And the nation becomes enraged. The colonists, all of them, 13 colonies, angry at Boston, angry at not Boston, angry at England for sending troops over. And you know, and there's obviously there's going to be some confusion on, you know, it was there an order to fire, was there not an order to fire, whatever. John Adams, who is Sam Adams' cousin, actually defends the troop at the trial and gets six of the eight acquittals, and then two of the soldiers that gets convicted on reduced charges, right? And Adams does this not because he believes in the soldiers and what they did or whatever, but because he believes that everybody's entitled to legal representation. And so again, this, you know, some of these founding ideas that are starting to creep in to some of our conversation. So here's one picture of the event of the Boston Massacre. You see the British over here on the right, the colonists over here on the left. And you know, you see the colonists raising sticks or whatever. And so that's one, you know, this is probably something that's going to be run in newspapers in England to showcase the anger and the violence of the colonist against the crown. And then we have the second and third image that we'll show here. You know, here are the English again on the right side, and the colonists on the left, kind of chaos and smoke. This one, you see the colonists telling them to stop, right? Hey, stop shooting, and you know, if you can control the narrative of the situation, then you can control the public outcry there, right? Eventually, Townsend dies, and he's replaced, and the new prime minister and the new person that's in charge of the collecting of revenue from the American colonies, repeals all the Townsend Acts except for the tax on tea and the customs and the courts. And the colonists see this as a major win. And so again, they celebrate. However, the celebration is short-lived because in 1773, 3 years after the Boston Massacre, we're going to see the Tea Act. And so the Tea Act is basically this. The English have they got these colonies in India during the 7 Years' War, which is the French and Indian War in the North America. And they have an English-owned company called the British East India Company that's in charge of exports from India, and they produce tea in India, and so they import tea in India from China. And so the British come up with this idea that what we'll do is we'll just give the British East India Company a natural monopoly to sell tea. And because we're creating this government not monopoly, we'll actually lower the price of tea for our citizens, right? Which should be a good thing. But it upsets the colonists because it reduces the profits from the smuggling of tea and from other places, right? And so, like, if you can buy, you know, if you can buy a good at the store for $2, why would you buy a smuggled good for 50 cents, you know, or $1.75, right? And risk getting in trouble. So the smugglers are going to have to drop their prices as well, and that upsets them. And so a lot of the merchants kind of frame their objection over this idea of a monopoly. And so the Tea Act results in a boycott of tea in the American colonies. So the American colonists aren't buying tea anymore. We're drinking coffee, we're doing other things, right? And so the ships from the British East India Company, they're coming over to the Americas, they're unable to unload their cargo. And so they're just stuck in the harbor, right? And so especially in Boston, the Boston merchants prevent their ships from coming into the harbor. Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, tells the boats to, hey, hang tight, we'll be okay. We're going to get back to business. We're going to start making money. And then in December 16th, 1773, townspeople gather in Boston Harbor, dressed like Native Americans. They board these ships. They throw the tea overboard. They cause over $1 million in modern money damage, and destroy, you know, the cargo of this fleet. And England is just beside itself. It's angry. King George insists that Massachusetts pay for the tea, and Massachusetts is like, I didn't do it, right? And so they're all upset. Obviously, you can kind of visualize and picture that. The thing about the Boston Tea Party that I always am curious about is like what it smelled like, you know, because I can imagine what a harbor smells like, and I know what tea smells like, but what is like ocean soaked nasty tea, like moldy tea smell like, and just like the odors of those days back in the 1700s, what that would have been like. And so in response to the Boston Tea Party, England is going to pass something called the Coercive Acts. The colonists are going to refer to these as the Intolerable Acts. And basically, it's a six-part law. Number one, Boston Harbor shut down until the East India Company is repaid for their tea. The colonial government is going to be placed under direct control of the King of England. Town hall meetings are subject to governor's approval, which means they're not going to happen. We're going to move any trial of an official of the king out of Massachusetts. So any soldier that's accused of a crime no longer has to face a court system in the colonies. The Quartering Act is going to be extended. No longer only are we going to give quarter to soldiers in abandoned barns or unused buildings, but now soldiers can come into occupied buildings, meaning that they can they can move people from their homes to live in there. And probably one of the most overlooked insults of this coercive act is this Quebec Act that is going to expand the boundaries of Quebec westward, which basically means that Massachusetts is going to be landlocked between the St. James River and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, back in this time, the people would associate or would have thought that, hey, my boundary is going to go as far as the land is. And so the colonists in Massachusetts just assumed that once, they hit the St. Lawrence River, they're going to go over into what's modern day Canada and just continue to move westward, right? But the King of England is going to give this to the Catholics in Quebec, which is going to really upset the Puritans, whatever Puritans are left in Boston during that time frame, because obviously they left England to get away from any remaining vestige of the Catholic Church that was in the Church of England. And so this is kind of a slap in the face to the founders of Massachusetts, the Puritans. Right? And so we have a political cartoon of that age of this is the coercive acts, and there's Boston, and here's England probably poking them with a stick. At least I think that's what's going on. And you have that. So you have these tea and the coercive acts, and that's going to prompt another call for a united Congress. Just like we had the Stamp Act Congress, well, now we're going to have what's going to be referred to as the First Continental Congress. And we're going to have 12 representatives. Georgia doesn't send it. We're going to have representatives from 12 colonies. Georgia's not going to send anybody. And the important thing here is when the First Continental Congress meets, they're going to still see themselves as British subjects, right? They're going to see themselves as British citizens. And so that First Continental Congress is going to get together, and they're going to demand a repeal of all the acts since 1773, basically going back to the French and Indian War. And they're going to call for another boycott of British goods until this is done. And then they ask that each state begin to form their own militia and form and regulate their own militia. So they're gonna look to build basically a citizen army in each colonist and each colony. The First Continental Congress ensures that a colony-wide boycott and a unified response to England, in the fact that we have the idea of we're still working with peaceful address of concerns to the king and to the government, but we start to see the groundswell of the possibility of violence with the creation of the local militias. So the First Continental Congress agrees to meet again in 1 year. So they're going to meet again in 1774 and discuss the events that have transpired. And so that's going to get us right there to where it's going to really start getting good. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something, and I will see you guys in chapter 6.